Greg Saville es cofundador de Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, mejor conocido como CEPTED. Es director ejecutivo de Alternancia Consulting, una firma internacional de consultoría para el diseño de barrios más seguros. Es profesor adjunto de la Universidad de Calgary en la Facultad de Diseño Ambiental. Ha sido consultor internacional en materia de seguridad urbana y CEPTED en el Departamento de Justicia de Estados Unidos, en la oficina de COPS y la Real Policía Montada Canadiense. Fundó y es distinguido miembro vitalicio de la Asociación Internacional CEPTED y es editor de la revista internacional CEPTED Association, Perspectiva CEPTED. Es también criminólogo especializado en métodos policiales, que actualmente es miembro de un equipo de planificación nacional sobre la dirección de la policía y la construcción de la comunidad, patrocinada por Estados Unidos, Oficina de Administración de Justicia. Démosle la bienvenida, por favor, a Greg Saville. Te encargo, Greg, nada más que nos mires o que me mires a mí, yo te estaré diciendo.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very thrilled to participate in this conference. My first time in Mexico City, and I'm very excited to spend an extra week to tour the city and the sites after the conference to enjoy what I've heard so much about over the years. I was asked to come to talk a bit about CEPTED and the concept of crime prevention using design, and so I had a couple of thoughts on what that would look like, and I wasn't sure exactly where to start or how to get going on this whole idea. So and by the way, that's my website, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions, so please write that down and send me an email. I'm happy to correspond at some point in the future if that's of interest to you. I'm pleased to do that. So do that. And I'm sure they're going to post this on the website, I think, as well, so you'll get to see that. So what I thought to do to get started is I thought I would talk to you about three things. Just three things. The first thing I want to tell you about the story of a woman. The second thing I want to talk to you about the motives and the opportunity for crime. And the third thing I want to talk a bit about tomorrow. I think this kind of frames the sorts of debates and issues that we're here to talk about, because I think that's where it all starts. And so you'll find a lot of discussion about the whole issue of theory and what causes crime and how do we prevent crime, and we have to know how to understand it before we know how to prevent it. And that usually falls to the field called criminology. I spent many years in criminology, going to the conferences and writing papers and doing research. And criminologists have a particular way of looking at the causes of crime using theory. And they talk about schools of thought, schools of theory. And in criminology, there's three great theories of crime. The one great theory is known as the classical school, in which the great philosophers and legal scholars of the 1700s and 1800s who wrote about human behavior and about man's vicissitudes, about right and wrong, and knowing right and wrong, and free will, and the ideas of deterrence, that you can imprison and police to stop crime. That was the first sort of wave. And even today there are people who follow the theories of deterrence, increasing sentences to stop crime. Whether it works or not, they believe the theory. Then there was a second wave led by some of the scientists of the last century, the Italian Lombroso, and others who believed you could look at crime because crime was a sickness. You could analyze the brains and the blood and the body and fix crime. And there are still those around today who do the biological explanations of crime and have some perspectives that inform us even today. And then in the turn of the century, there were some of the great European sociologists, Tonnes from Germany and Durkheim from France, and then some of the American sociologists like Robert Park and Robert McKenzie in the University of Chicago, who believed that social structure was the cause of crime. And that if you looked at the structure of families and inequality and poverty, those were the reasons and those were the causes, and that's how we prevent it. And so you're left with these very different perspectives on crime. And you're left at times very confused. My students often say at the end of the story, they say, well, so what do I do? Who do I listen to? How do I prevent it? Where do I go? And the interesting thing about this and this perspective on theories is that they all have a bit of the truth and they all have a bit of the falsehoods. Because no one theory explains all crime. Because part of the problem is crime is a bit of a myth. It's a bit of a fantasy. Because when you think of it, a doctor doesn't deal with illness in society. A doctor deals with your illness when you walk in front of her. She will look at the specific issues you confront at the time, the symptoms you generate, and will treat those symptoms, not all of illness. And that's kind of what we have with crime. And so it really wasn't until much later when we stopped asking questions about the why of crime and started asking questions about the where of crime that some of the clarity, I think, began to happen. And it starts with the story of a woman. And this is a kind of a funny story because it's, first of all, it's true. Secondly, it started with a woman who identified herself as just a housewife. And this housewife had an impact on her community that spread like ripples through her society that reaches us even today, 50 years later. And the story is the woman was standing on the corner one day and was looking down her street where her neighbors were and saw these surveyors with a camera surveying the neighborhood. And she walked down to them and said, "What are you doing? Who are you?" And they said, "Oh, we're doing a survey for engineering." "What are you going to do?" "Oh, we're going to build a highway. The city's putting a highway through here." And she said, "You're putting a highway through my neighborhood?" "Well, we live here." Who's telling us?" And the engineer said, "Oh, I don't, it's not my job. I don't know." And so she started to investigate this business about the neighborhood and the relationship to the surroundings. And she noticed the neighborhood that she lived in was a part of New York called Greenwich Village, that the streets around her were actually very active, very busy, and weren't very high income back then. They were actually kind of low income. And yet they were very safe, very vibrant. And yet less than a mile away, the streets were very unsafe. There was a lot of crime. Why was that, she asked. What was that? And her method of looking at carefully, walking the streets, working at the neighborhood, that's what triggered her analysis. And she wrote a book. The name of the book was The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And the name of the woman is Jane Jacobs. And that's how Septet started. And although Jane Jacobs never talked about Septet, and we invited her to our conference, but was much later in her life, and she wasn't able to travel very much, she was very much about neighborhood revitalization, neighborhood life, neighborhood vitality. That's what she saw, and that's what she did. And that's how Septet started. That's the theory of Septet. So there's some organizations that now promote this concept and deal with it. You know that this course, this conference, is through the Latin American chapter of the International Septet Association. And they're a big supporter, and there's lots of resources available. The Septet movement has many different avenues of information. This is a newsletter we publish through the International Septet Association called